Wealth Migrate, I'm curious about this international play. Even in the panel yesterday, the well-meaning but immediate association with international was, holy cow, so much opportunity for fraud. When I was in South Africa with you, one of the big challenges was that so many US promoters have defrauded overseas investors. So in this space, as you're trying to figure out how are you going to help facilitate international wealth to invest in the United States, what are the systems, what are you doing to kind of address that, or is it just a egotistical, self-centered view of Americans to think that it's all about fraud when we go overseas?
Yeah, look, the fraud thing yesterday caught me a little bit off guard, and I realized how important that mindset actually is. You know, for me, Joseph was out in South Africa about 6 weeks ago, and one of our business partners, RJ, was there as well. And he wouldn't come to South Africa for 2 years because he figured he would get AIDS, because the mosquitoes bite people with AIDS, and then we're going to bite him. Now, you know, I'm not joking. This is an educated guy from America, and he wouldn't come to South Africa. So this whole kind of mindset and everything is quite a big thing. But I think what people need to understand is that there's so much money in the emerging world looking for safety, wealth preservation in the first world. And to come back to answer your question, Joseph, is that for me, what excites me with crowdfunding is it's just an enabler. We've been doing this for a long time. We've done 10,779 international transactions to date. And whether we've got a crowdfunding platform or whether we're working off a spreadsheet is immaterial. We know how to help people set up their tax, their compliance, their structuring. I mean, just opening a bank account in America, it's impossible. And I mean, Brandon and I had a conversation yesterday. You know, it's all good and well to want to go and get the guy overseas, but actually, or the lady, but it's very difficult from a just logistical perspective. What we've done is we figured that out many years ago, before crowdfunding even came about. And by partnering with the best people in terms of, from an IT perspective, portal compliance, we've been able to marry existing business with technology. And by doing that, we've allowed the people in the emerging world to get access to the first world. And you know, to come back to the question you asked Jesse, I personally believe, and I'd like to think that everyone at this table probably agrees with me here, is that the 20th century is about competition. But this pie is too big to compete. The pie is big enough for us all to work together. And the beauty of the 21st century is it's about partnership. You know, if I want to go to the Midwest and invest in the Midwest, why would I try and do it on my own? Why wouldn't I deal with someone that knows what they're doing? Why wouldn't I deal with, you know, both of you guys? You guys know what you're doing. Why come to America and try and sound like an expert when I can just partner with the best? And philosophy, if you understand it, is that we're not just doing that in North America, we're doing it in Australia, we're doing it in London, etc. So that we can provide investors and sponsors, if you want to call it that, the opportunity to play on the global space, but it's all about partnership.
So earlier, PI had talked about the ongoing support of investors, and you guys have repeat investors and people who are rolling their returns back in, and as a proprietary platform and kind of owning that, that's been a high priority. Can you kind of school some of the rest of us on what you see as kind of the top things that folks that are thinking about supporting an investor need to be looking at?
When you say support, you mean like
after the raise? Yeah,
after the raise. It all comes down to constant communication, actually, being almost always available, for better or worse. You know, it's
just don't accept the international investors. They call you at like 3 in the morning and think it's a normal.
Trust me, it works both ways. American time's not the only standard time zone.
Oh my gosh, maybe that's true. Okay.
Yeah, no, I mean, it does. It just comes down to really understanding, I think, putting yourself in that person's shoes. And so I've just given you some money. I still might have fear that that person's going to go run off and buy a car. I mean, literally, we had somebody say, like, if I give you my money, are you going to go buy a Corvette with it? And so, first of all, it's $10,000, so no. Yeah, exactly. So it's, you know, it's hard to say because it hasn't really, for us, we've been around for just almost 9 months now. which is, I guess, long in this industry in some ways, but it's just, you know, keeping them up to date. We do some things like general emails that keep them updated on what's going on. We keep them updated with project updates, because maybe you think they only care about yield, but you know, a lot of times they actually care what that person's doing with the money that they've been handed. So the support really just comes in being communicative and open. When there's a withdrawal request for their interest, then we process that instantly. So I don't know if that answers your questions in terms of support. Those are really what we've experienced so far.
My questions, the hard ones, are continuing. Brandon, ready? So my question is, earlier we were talking about the institutional investors that are pinging the peer-to-peer lending sites and grabbing deals off before, and I'm curious about where you guys are with that. What percentage of your investors are institutional versus what I'll call retail? And do they have a premier access that gives them a competitive advantage over me when I come to your site to invest?
Right now, the majority of our investors are still retail, but anybody who's paying attention to the space recognizes that basically the institutional players are very interested in it. Real estate is a little bit different than, say, consumer debt. It's not, you know, as easy to kind of originate at mass scale and package it the way that, say, Lending Club or Crossfire does. That being said, the institutional investors are very, very interested. And again, as we talk about real estate, you're talking about a scale of projects where you're going to require institutional capital in some senses to make the marketplace actually function. I mean, we view the institutional investor as actually critical to allowing the retail investor to be able to have access to all those deals. Does the institutional investor have priority access to deals in front of the retail investor? No. That's kind of goes against the mission of what we're trying to create. That being said, the institutional investor tends to be interested in different types of information than the retail investor. They view deals differently, the way they want to underwrite it, the way they want to think about it. So there is a little more handwork that goes into working with those people. And I think that, you know, in the next 6 months, 9 months, you're going to see, you know, waves of institutional money coming into this space in the same way you've seen in the peer-to-peer lending space or the small business loans.
So, for you guys, one of the biggest challenges is going to be pulling together an inventory of products and communicating what kind of curation and due diligence has gone into those. What are kind of the key metrics that you plan on communicating to the customers or the potential new investors of the curation process and how a deal ended up on the platform?
So great question. So we're doing a lot of due diligence before they even get to us. So the deals that we're actually bringing to the platform have been fully vetted by us. A very experienced team we pulled together to do that. And then we're actually outlining all our due diligence process for people to see. And if anybody wants to talk to us extensively about that, we'll openly discuss with them, you know, what's going on in that, and if they'd like to see some further stricter standards, we'll definitely, you know, look at those. Specifically, if the sponsor is asking for more, we'll actually look at changing some of that stuff if it makes sense for our investor base. So it's evolving, right? We're learning on a different basis from a debt deal versus an equity deal, but you know, we already have our standards in place, and we're making those public and transparent as possible.
So I'm curious, you had mentioned, Scott, you had mentioned the partnership model, and before you visited me in Minnesota, which you haven't done yet, you visited an even colder place of North Dakota, and you've put product on your platform from North Dakota. Why is that in any way appealing to an international investor? I mean, North Dakota's not really seen as very appealing to a U.S. investor.
Well, as a matter of interest, I actually want to ask, has anyone in this room been to North Dakota?
Wow.
That's quite interesting. That's quite interesting, because when I come through customs and I tell people I'm going to North Dakota, the customs official don't know where I'm going. And it's very interesting, you see, because you come back to partnership, Joseph, and if you're dealing with the right people, they're at the front end of what is happening. And I mean, I literally arrived yesterday, I picked up the newspaper, and I've got the New York Times here and the Washington Post, and we were told last year that America would be a net exporter of oil by 2017. Interesting enough, just yesterday in the newspaper, you're starting to export oil this year. Literally, that was the headlines yesterday. And we went to North Dakota originally thinking that we would get into the residential space. There was this whole housing shortage, et cetera, et cetera. And from experience, we've done this in Africa already. You've got to be very careful of boom-bust cycles. And long story short, we've got into the industrial flex space because there's a lot of blue-collar people. It takes 28 people to service one oil rig. And I'm not talking the guys that are physically mining the oil. I'm talking the guys that are bringing the trucks in, bringing the water, taking the sand out, et cetera, et cetera. And no one's providing a service for them. And so we decided not to focus on the gold rush, but to focus on selling the shovels. And the thing that we like about North Dakota is it achieves our 3 objectives for partnership. Firstly, we've got a strong partner on the ground. Secondly, they're in a niche. We don't want to be king to everyone. We want to be specific. And thirdly, and most importantly, it's scalable. We can do one project after another project after another project, and the learning cycle just gets shorter and shorter and shorter. And what excites me most and what I like most about America, which, to be fair, I'm not even sure that most of you realize the advantage that you've got. In Australia, there's 20 million people, there's only 4 cities. And if there's a good project, I guarantee every single one of us at this table would know about it. And most of you in this room would know about it. Because it's such a small, transparent market that everyone knows about good deals. But America is so big that no one can know everything. And that is actually a fantastic opportunity because it allows people access to good opportunities. Whereas in Australia, as an example, you've got to be right at the top of the pile to get access to those good opportunities. And because it's so transparent, the returns are diluted. And North Dakota is a classic example of that, is that most Americans don't even know that there's a good opportunity in North Dakota, but that doesn't mean that there's not good opportunities where they are in the Northwest, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what excites us about the opportunities here.
So we've got about, thank you guys, that was fantastic. I really appreciate it. So we've got time for about 15 minutes of questions. And of course, I could keep asking all of them, but it's probably far more interesting if we have something here. So who's got our first question? Mark, I know you have one, and then we'll go right here.
No, I don't. I had it.
You were going to gossip with Joy about, right? I'm sorry, sitting next, I don't know your name.
Close down.
Do you have a question?
Sure. So you all talked about there was a problem that you fixed, and you're underwriting better than banks somehow. So how is that really happening? Is it the regulatory environment that makes them conservative, or is it the 5 C's of credit that is not what we need to be looking at? So what is it?
So the question for everybody to hear is that we often hear that our underwriting standards are better for who, and how is it better than the banks, and is it better than the banks because of technology, of knowledge, or are the banks stuck in a regulatory environment that is restricting them? And
Can I answer that quickly?
yeah, you're going to talk about the U.S. regulatory environment of banks?
I'm going to talk about it generally.
Okay, so that sounds fine. Go ahead.
So my wife is an attorney, and she worked for the biggest bank in South Africa that's owned by Barclays Bank worldwide. And she was part of their equities division, so they would go into real estate and they would ultimately vet developers, and where the bank would bring the debt, they would also partner with them on the equity side. And technically you had the most efficient, spectacular, business-minded, legal, accounting degrees on the planet. And believe it or not, this very same bank foreclosed on someone during the global financial crisis for R1 billion, which is the equivalent of about $150,000. And 6 years prior to that, they'd foreclosed on the exact same 2 brothers for the exact same amount of money. And my point being is that it doesn't matter how clever you are or how many due diligence systems you've got, et cetera, et cetera. Generally, corporate people are not looking after money in the same way that private people look after money. It's very simple. And the beauty with technology is that, and I think Brandon, you spoke about it, is that your track record will now be consistent. You can't, I mean, it's unthinkable that the same bank could lend to the same people and lose money twice in 5 years. But I can tell you what happened, because the team that gave them the money the first time moved on and started doing something else. And that consistency and that intelligence wasn't kept in the system. And it's not just an American thing. The beauty with crowdfunding is that the intelligence will be kept, like on eBay. If you make a mistake on eBay, it's there forever.
So I'm curious, Brandon, if you could talk a little bit about the question of where the the bank financing in your projects are? Is it, that are also being crowdfunded? Are you doing a gap equity financing to fill in where banks are leaving off, or is it a replacement for the bank financing? Why aren't those developers in front of banks instead?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. It gets to your original question. It's not that anybody's new has like discovered a secret way to underwrite real estate that no one had ever thought of. Most banks, most private equity funds do a pretty good job of underwriting real estate. I mean, that's debatable, but the reality is that they're focused on a very, very small percentage of the market. And I think where everybody has been able to find spaces, places where banks, other private funds are basically not playing. And to get to your point, in a lot of cases that's a gap mezzanine preferred equity position where banks are only willing to lend so much, and the project needs another several $1 million, and that's a lot of equity for one person to write a check for. I think in the case of patch of land, you're talking about senior lending, but it's the same idea. There's markets where the banks, if you're sitting at a bank, your job is to check a box and make sure that what you're doing falls within that box. And there's a lot of real estate in the world that doesn't fall within the boxes that people are checking right now, and where you traditionally see innovation in any market is on the fringes where the institutional players, the existing incumbents aren't willing to play, and you combine that with new technology that's come around in the last few years, and you combine that with some of the regulatory changes that have happened, and it's created this perfect market where a lot of people have quickly been able to come in and fill these niches that the traditional players just aren't in.
And I would add to that too, there's an element of speed that matters a lot, especially when you're dealing with funding versus a bank. That's been a big one for us. It's the ability to fund quickly for the kinds of deals that we're doing.
So I want to add, not to over-promote, but at the learn.communityleader.com site, we also have a very interesting white paper that was co-written by a former bank president, targeting